Chapter 1. When the Sky Went Blank. Elias Mercer kept his hands on the big valve wheel until his palms stung. The hub sat low beside the water, a wide block of concrete and steel with pipes the size of tree trunks. It had been built to take bad water and make it clean again, day after day, without anyone thinking about it. Now it felt like a bunker that had lost its purpose, a place still doing its job even after the world stopped asking. The air inside the control room was damp and warm. A row of screens hung over the main board, but most of them had frozen hours ago. Some showed the same warning box on a loop. Others were stuck on old numbers that did not move. The only things still alive were the analog gauges, their needles twitching with the slow pulse of pressure, and a small printer that fed thin strips of paper from a slot with a steady, patient clatter. Outside, the sky over Puget Sound had taken on a color Elias could not name. Not dark, not bright. Flat, like someone had wiped the shine off it. A long time ago, a storm like that would have made people post about it and joke about the end of the world. Today, nobody posted. Nobody joked. The phones had gone quiet early, and then the radios. Even the emergency channel had died in the middle of a sentence, leaving a soft hiss that never came back. He stepped out onto the graded catwalk. Below him, the settling tanks spread out like shallow pools, each one rimmed with railings and ladders. The water inside was higher than it should have been. The storm drains had backed up when the city pumps shut down. Now the hub was taking in more than it could move through on its own. A woman in a hard hat stood near the far door with a clipboard tucked under her arm, as if the board still mattered. Her name was Tessa. She had been calm all morning, calling out tasks and checking people off on a list, but now she just stared at her phone like it might suddenly wake up. "It's gone," she said, not to him, not to anyone, the network, all of it. Elias did not answer. He had tried to make his own call an hour ago. He had tried the same number 3 times. The last try ended in a sharp click and a dead tone. After that, the phone stopped doing anything but showing a blank bar where service used to be. A siren began to rise in the distance, and then it cut off as if someone had pinched the sound between 2 fingers. Elias waited, listening for it to come back. It did not. A car alarm started somewhere across the road, then died the same way. The city was learning a new kind of quiet. He walked to the west side of the catwalk where he could see the sound. The water was gray and calm, and the far shore looked like a sketch done in pencil. On the ridges around the bay, tall radio towers stood like thin trees. They had always been there, part of the background. Elias had never paid them much mind. Now they were changing. At first he thought it was fog wrapping around the towers. Then he saw the straight lines. Dark frames took shape along the supports, like scaffolding being built by invisible hands. Pieces slid into place without cranes, without crews, without any light show. It was quiet work. Too quiet for something that big. Between towers, threads formed in the air, faint and hard to track, like spider silk that caught the last light. The threads stretched from one point to another, not sagging, not swaying in the wind. Where they touched a tower, the metal took on a slick sheen, as if it had been coated. Then the tower's blinking light went out. Elias watched for people running in the streets. He watched for smoke. He watched for jets, for flashes, for something that looked like a fight. There was none of it. Cars still sat at stop signs. A few figures moved along the sidewalk, slow and unsure, like they were trying to decide whether to go home or keep walking. No one looked up for long. Even when they did, nothing seemed to chase them. "What is that?" Tessa asked. She had joined him at the rail. Her voice was small now. Elias shook his head once. He could not find the right word. The towers were being stripped of what made them useful, but the steel itself was not being torn down. It looked like the towers were being remade into something else, something that cared about shape more than function. One of the workers jogged across the yard toward the catwalk. His name was René, and he usually moved like he had extra power in his legs, like he could not sit still. Now he was out of breath, and his face was slick with sweat. "The south gate is locked," René said. "Not by us. The motor won't run." "The manual bar is jammed. The motor won't run?" Tessa repeated, and her eyes flicked toward the breaker boxes like they might be able to explain. "Nothing runs," Renee said. "The trucks are dead. The forklift is dead. I tried the backup radio. It's dead. Even the badge scanner is dead." Elias felt the weight of it settle into his chest. Power loss was normal. It happened in storms. It happened in heat waves. There were plans for it. There were backup steps, and after that there were human hands. But this felt different. It was not just loss. It was removal. The world was being emptied of signal, one tool at a time. He looked back toward the tanks. The water line was still rising. If it reached the upper rim, the hub would flood the lower bays. That would ruin the filter beds, ruin the pumps, ruin the one job this place could still do without help. "We need to lower the intake," Elias said. He spoke louder than he meant to, as if volume could cut through what was happening. "We pull it down now, or we lose the whole plant." Tessa nodded fast, grateful for something that sounded like a plan. "Do it," she said. "What do you need?" Elias moved with purpose, not because he felt brave, but because motion kept his mind from spinning. He took the stairs down to the lower platform where the main manual gate valve sat behind a hatch. The hatch was heavy and damp. When he pulled it open, warm air rolled out, smelling of river mud and treated chemicals. The valve wheel was taller than his chest. It had not been turned by hand in years. A motor normally did this work, smooth and simple, with a switch on the board. Elias set his boots on the grating, wrapped both hands around the rim, and pulled. Nothing moved. He adjusted his stance and pulled again, using his back. The wheel shuddered a fraction, then stuck. Rust cracked somewhere inside the housing with a sound like dry bread snapping. Elias pulled again and again, the wheel inching forward in tiny jumps. His arms started to burn. Above him, the building felt too still. No fans. No hum of transformers. No distant buzz of lights. He could hear his own breath, the scrape of the wheel, and the slow slosh of water in the pipe. He kept turning. He thought of the workers who had left earlier in the day, saying they needed to check on family. No one had stopped them. No one had told them where to go instead. At first it had seemed normal, just fear, just a storm of bad news. Now it looked like a line of people quietly stepping out of a world that no longer had a map. After a long stretch of effort, the wheel finally began to move in a steady way. Elias felt the pressure change through the metal, a deep shift that traveled into his hands. The gauge beside the pipe twitched. Water flow eased. Somewhere above, a float sensor must have tried to send a message and failed. He turned until his shoulders shook, then locked the wheel in place. He leaned on it for a moment, eyes closed, letting the cool metal press into his forehead. When he climbed back to the control room, the printer was still running. It was the only sound in the building that felt normal. The strip of paper hung over the edge of the desk like a long tongue. Tessa stood by the window. "I can't get anyone," she said. "Not state, not city, not the field office. It's like there's no one on the other side." Elias walked to the printer and tore off the newest strip. It was not a status report, not a sensor log. It was plain text, stamped in block letters, as if it had been prepared ahead of time for a day like this. Assignment notice. E. Mercer. Report to Signal Null Vault 14. Cascade Sector. Proceed on foot if necessary. No electronics during entry or exit. Time window, immediate. Elias stared at the words until they blurred, then came back sharp again. A vault. A place he had signed up for in a stack of forms years ago because it seemed like a remote risk, something that would never reach him. The notice felt cold in his hands, not because the paper was cold, but because it made the world outside feel real in a way the silent towers had not yet. Renee stepped closer, peering over Elias's shoulder. "What is that?" he asked. Elias folded the strip once, then again, small and neat. His mind moved through details the way it always did when the ground shifted. Location, distance, water, food, tools, people? He looked at the screens. He looked at the dark window. He looked at the silent gauges that still told the truth. "I'm leaving," he said. Tessa's face tightened. "Where?" Elias kept his voice steady. "A shelter site. It's outside the city." Renee gave a sharp, nervous laugh. "You believe that's real?" Elias did not answer him. He walked to his locker, grabbed a pack that had lived there for years with a change of clothes and a first aid kit. He filled a bottle from the clean tap while it still worked. He took a wrench from the wall rack and hesitated, then took a second one, smaller, that fit into a side pocket. He paused at the door, hand on the handle, and listened. No sirens, no engines, no distant talk over radios, no storm roar, just the soft click of the printer behind him, still doing its one task, spilling orders into a room that no longer had a chain of command. Elias stepped outside. The air felt washed clean, but not fresh. The sky over the water stayed flat and wrong. Far away, the towers continued to shift and grow new shapes without sound. Somewhere in the city, a single bird called once, then fell quiet. Elias tightened the straps on his pack and started walking, leaving the hub behind to drain itself as long as it could. He did not look back until he reached the road. When he did, the building was already fading into the larger silence, just another structure waiting to be noticed, or not noticed, by whatever had come across the sound. Chapter 2. The Botanist Who Missed the Evacuation. Mara Kincaid stood knee-deep in the warm mist of the growth room with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands moving through trays of pale soil. The chamber lived in half-light, fed by dim strips along the ceiling that mimicked dawn and dusk without ever showing a true sun. Thick shelves held rows of sealed tanks where soft white threads drifted through cloudy gel. Each tank held a strain meant to thrive in places where most life would fail. She tapped the side of one unit with her knuckle. The fluid inside had taken on a faint yellow haze, a sign that the culture had gone hungry. The feed pump should have corrected that by now. "Come on," she muttered, moving to the console. The screen blinked once and froze. A tone cut off mid-chirp from the hall beyond the chamber door. The backup panel beside the main unit stayed dark. Mara lifted her wrist and tried to check the time. Her band showed a blank bar where the clock had always been. She pressed the side button harder than needed, then lowered her arm and stared at the rows of living things that now had no one to speak for them. Down the hall, a fire alarm started its opening trill, and then dropped into silence, like a song half remembered. For a moment she wondered if someone had pulled a breaker by mistake. She ran. The corridor outside the lab curved past storage bays and student workrooms. A few doors stood open. Papers scattered across desks like the people who had used them had stood up mid-task and drifted away. A pair of grad students leaned over a bench near the cold room, whispering to each other in voices too low for her to catch. "What is happening?" one of them said when he saw her. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "Stay here," Mara said, though she did not know why she said it. "I need to find the control desk." She reached the main office just as the hall lights dimmed, and then came back on in a softer shade. The central board was frozen on a status map of the lower wing. All green, all lies. She lifted the desk phone. No tone. She lifted the second one, the third. Nothing. The outer doors at the end of the hall slid shut with a soft hiss that felt too polite for the moment. The evacuation system had been built to speak loud, to push people toward exits with sound and motion. Now it had sealed the floor and gone quiet, like it was done trying. Mara turned back toward the lab wing. The thought of the cultures sitting alone in the dark made her chest tighten. She moved fast, her steps sharp on the tile, calling names as she went. "Lena Park. Anyone in the wet lab, answer me." 2 more students stepped out of a side room. One of them held a pipette like a charm, fingers wrapped around it as if it could explain things. "The alarms cut out," Lena said. "We did not get any follow-up." Mara made a quick count. 5 students. That was it. A building meant for hundreds. Down to 5 and one woman who refused to accept that the day had turned without her consent. "We go now," Mara said. "We take the stairs. Leave your gear." "What about the samples?" Park asked, already shaking his head as if he knew the answer. Mara looked past him through the glass wall into the growth room. The tanks glowed faint and steady, unaware of the change in the air beyond their seals. She took 1 step toward them, then stopped. "Get to the exit," she said. "I will meet you at the west stair." She went back inside the chamber, moving from rack to rack with hands that had steadied under stress 100 times before. She cut power to the feed lines one by one, so the cultures would not starve when the pumps failed. She adjusted vents by hand to keep the air inside each unit from turning stale too fast. She slid a strip of tape over a cracked seal that had been on her to-do for weeks. Her mind ran through the strains like a prayer. Low-light root net, salt-tolerant mesh, closed-loop fungus she had helped grow from a fragment no larger than a grain of rice. She could not carry them. She could only make sure they were not abandoned in the worst way. When she stepped back into the hall, the lights were gone for good. Only the thin green line over the exit door still shone, more habit than promise. The stairwell echoed with footsteps. The students were already moving down, too fast, their fear loud in the narrow space. Mara followed, counting floors without knowing if the numbers meant anything anymore. They emerged into the main lobby and froze. The tall glass wall that faced the city gave them a wide view of the skyline. Seattle had never been a quiet place, not even at night, but now the towers stood under a sky that looked thinned, as if part of it had been scraped away. Across the tops of buildings, shapes had formed that did not match any bridge or crane. Frames arched between rooftops, smooth and dark, with lines stretching from point to point like a web that refused to sag. As they watched, one of the last working streetlights blinked and then went out. A pair of office windows on the far block went dark in the same breath. It was not a wave. It was selection. "They are not touching the people," Lena said in a hush. Mara scanned the street below. A man stood beside a stalled bus, one foot lifted as if he had meant to climb aboard. He stood there a long time, unbothered by the lattice forming high above him. "They are taking something else," Mara said. The front doors opened with a slow slide, like the building had finally remembered its role. The group stepped outside into air that felt thin and wrong. The sound of the city was gone, replaced by a hollow calm that made even their breathing feel too loud. They walked 3 blocks before a sharp buzz cut through the quiet. A small drone skimmed down the street at head height, its shell marked with the seal of the emergency office. It drifted toward Mara as if it knew her, then wobbled and dropped to the pavement with a soft crack. A strip of paper pushed from a slot in its side and curled in on itself. Mara bent and pulled it free. Assignment notice. M. Kincaid. Report to Signal Null Vault 14. Cascade Sector. Proceed on foot if necessary. No electronics during entry or exit. Time window, immediate. The drone gave a faint click and went still. Lena stared at the paper. "What is that place?" "A shelter," Mara said, though the word felt thin in her mouth. She folded the strip, careful not to tear it. The thought of a place that could still speak in print felt like a hand on her back, firm and insistent. Park swallowed. "Are you going to go?" Mara looked at the students, at their packs still half full of tools that now meant nothing, at the dark windows that had once glowed with late work and tired hope. She thought of the growth rooms sealed in shadow, of the cultures that could change how people lived in places that had no light left. She thought of leaving them behind for good, not with care, but with intent. "I have to," she said. Lena's mouth tightened. "Then we come with you." "No," Mara said, and surprised herself with how sure her voice sounded. "This site is not for teams. It is for skills. You need to find people who need help here. This city is still full of them." They stood in a loose circle while the lattice overhead thickened, its lines drawing new shapes that did not care about names or maps. At last, Park nodded, slow and firm. "Go," he said. "We will hold this end." Mara did not hug them. She did not say things that might be hard to keep straight later. She only touched each shoulder once, a simple mark of where she had been, then turned and walked toward the river path that led out of the core. After 2 blocks, she began to feel the city empty around her, not in ruins, but in attention. The shops stood whole. The signs stayed lit for a few more breaths before they went dark. The street felt like a shell someone had stepped out of. By the time she reached the rail line, the skyline behind her had gained a new crown of dark arches. The web over the towers had grown thick enough to blur their shapes. She held the folded notice in her coat pocket and moved on, carrying the last steady pieces of her work in her head alone. Chapter 3. Signal null, Vault 14. The path into the hills bent away from the main road and narrowed into a track that had not been kept in years. Ferns brushed Elias at the knees as he walked, and the trees closed overhead until the sky became a pale strip between branches. The air felt heavier here, damp and rich with rot and sap, as if the forest had decided to keep its own time. The vault door stood at the end of a short gravel run, a round slab of dull metal set into a concrete wall that rose straight out of the ground. No signs, no lights, only a narrow box at waist height with a slot for paper. Elias pulled the folded notice from his pack and slid it into the slot. The box hummed, then stopped. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the ground under his boots shivered, not like a quake, but like something waking. The door turned inward with a soft grind and revealed a short tunnel that sloped down into dark. A voice behind him said, "You got one too." He turned and saw a woman stepping off the tree line, her coat smeared with soil, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. She held the same narrow slip of paper in her hand, already creased and soft from use. "Elias Mercer," he said without thinking, because his mind was still set on forms and lists. "Mara Kincaid," she said. She did not smile. They walked into the tunnel side by side, their steps echoing off the curved walls. The door rolled shut behind them, sealing the forest away in a clean, final sound. The tunnel ended in a small entry bay with racks of gear, a bank of switches set behind a clear panel, and a heavy inner door marked with a single word in block letters: "Deploy." Mara crossed the room and ran her fingers along the edge of the panel. "No screens," she said. "That is rare. Not here," Elias said. He set his pack on the floor and took out the wrench he had carried from the hub. "This place does not trust signal. That is the point." Mara shot him a glance. "I was not speaking as a fault." Elias shrugged. He had learned long ago that people heard their own doubts in other voices. He pointed at the switch bank. "Full seal needs all of these down. Air, pumps, comm line, light strips, the lot. We do not open this place halfway." "Then why even come?" Mara said. He turned to face her. The room was lit by a single ceiling bar that gave off a steady white glow. It made her look tired in a way that did not come from sleep loss alone. "Because the longer we leave it loose, the louder it is to anything that listens for pattern," he said. Mara folded her arms. "I came here because I was told it was safe." "Safe is a state," Elias said, "not a switch." She did not reply at once. Instead, she stepped closer to the panel and began to scan the labels, reading them aloud in a low voice. "Water intake, waste line, vent feed, sensor line." She stopped at the bottom row. "Why is this still live?" Elias followed her finger. A small red tab sat under a line that did not match the rest of the board. Phase 2 core. He felt a cold pinch under his ribs. "It should not be," he said. Mara lifted the clear cover and pressed the tab. Nothing happened. No shift in pressure. No change in tone. "Missing," she said. It was not a guess. They sealed the vault anyway. Elias moved down the board in order, cutting power by hand. Each switch made a firm click, a sound with weight. The air grew warmer as the fans died. The lights dimmed and then cut to a softer glow from backup strips set low along the wall. The room lost its sense of edge and time, like a cave that had always been here. When the last switch went down, the inner door slid open on rails that had not known grease in a long while. They passed into the main chamber, a wide space carved from bedrock with rows of empty frames meant to hold equipment that had never arrived. Tanks sat dry in their cradles. Pipes ran along the ceiling and vanished into sealed ports. Mara let out a slow breath. "This is not ready," she said. "It is as ready as it will ever be," Elias said. He moved to a waist-high console that held a keypad and a single narrow display that glowed with plain text. "System start. Core status check." The line blinked once, then changed. "Phase 2 core not found. System halt." Mara rubbed her temples. "So that is it. We sit here and wait for air to turn stale." "No," Elias said. She looked at him, sharp now. "Then what?" He leaned over the console and tapped the metal frame like he could coax it into honesty. This place was built to go quiet, to be so dull that it did not stand out from the ground around it. That core was the heart of that trick. Without it, the vault is just a sealed box with a rhythm. A rhythm of what? Mara said. Of water cycles, airflow, heat shifts, Elias said. Anything that repeats. That is what they are taking outside, not people. Pattern. Mara walked the length of the chamber, her boots echoing on stone. She touched one of the empty frames, then another, as if expecting them to explain. I am a botanist, she said. I work with things that grow in dark places. I do not tune signal. You tune systems that do not need light, Elias said. That is close. She stopped at a blank wall, where a wide port waited with nothing behind it. A label above it named the missing part in neat print. Living Stack Interface. Mara read the words twice. I know this, she said. I was part of a pilot that used layered cultures to scrub air and water without active tools. It was still in test. Elias felt a grim relief settle into his bones. Where? Under the north wing of the university, Mara said. Biophysics. They called it the living stack because it was more forest than machine. That is our core, Elias said. Mara turned. You want us to go back out there? He nodded. Now, before this place warms enough to matter. Mara laughed once, a short sound that held no joy. I just came from a city that has stopped speaking. The sky is being stitched into something else, and you want to step back into it. Elias moved closer, keeping his voice flat. This vault cannot hide on its own. It will stand out like a lamp in a field. That is the kind of thing the towers take. Mara's jaw tightened. You are certain? I have been certain of pipes and pumps my whole life, he said. This is the same. Without the core, this place will be found. They stood in the half-light, the backup strips painting long shadows across bare stone. Somewhere in the walls, metal ticked as it cooled, settling into a state it had never known before. Mara reached into her coat and took out the folded notice that had led her here. She opened it, then closed it again, as if it could change. All right, she said. We go get it. Elias exhaled and did not try to hide it. We power this place down first. All the way. No sound, no pulse. Mara nodded, already moving back toward the entry bay. Then we come back with a forest in our arms. They began the sequence in silence, hands steady, both aware that the quiet they were making was not peace, but a kind of cover. Chapter 4. Total Power Down. Elias stood with one hand on the main breaker bar while Mara counted the last steps from a paper chart laid flat on the metal bench. The room had already dimmed to a soft band of floor light that traced the walls like a path meant for people who had forgotten how to see in caves. The air felt thick, not from heat, but from the sense that the place was about to lose its memory of motion. Mara tapped the chart with her finger. After this one we lose the clocks, she said. Her voice did not echo. The vault had begun to swallow sound. Elias nodded. He reached up and pulled the bar down. The small display above the console went blank, taking the last moving mark in the room with it. The soft glow along the wall flickered once and held, now driven by a coil meant only to keep people from panic, not to keep a system alive. Time slipped. Not all at once, but in a way that made Elias blink and feel unsure of how long he had been standing still. Without screens, without a tone to mark a second, the mind slid off its habits. He became aware of his pulse in his neck, of the scrape of his boot on stone when he shifted his weight. Mara folded the chart and slipped it into her coat. I do not like this, she said. I need to see numbers. You will not get them here, Elias said. This place is meant to be boring to anything that hunts signal. It cannot keep that promise while it counts itself. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the empty frames, the sealed ports, the dark overhead rails. It feels like we are turning off more than lights, she said. That is because we are, Elias said. He moved to the inner door and set his hand on the round wheel that would unlock it. The metal was cold in a way that felt older than the room. Once this opens, the vault is not a vault. It is a hole in the ground. Mara stepped beside him. In the low light, her eyes shone like she had already been crying, though her face was calm. "Then open it." Elias braced his shoulder and spun the wheel. It fought him for the first quarter turn, then gave way with a long, harsh cry from deep in the frame. The sound filled the chamber and made Mara flinch. She caught herself and held still, as if even a breath might make it worse. The door slid back along its track, slow and heavy, and a wedge of forest light spilled in across the stone floor. It was green and wild, filtered through leaves, nothing like the whitewash of the vault lamps. Elias felt it strike his face, and knew at once that he had been living inside a box of his own making long before this day. They stood at the threshold and did not move. Outside, the trees swayed in a wind that had never touched the vault walls. Ferns leaned into the opening like curious guests. Somewhere above, a bird called, then cut off mid-note as if it had forgotten its place. Mara whispered, "It is too bright." "It is just day," Elias said. But the words sounded weak. He took the first step out, boots sinking into damp soil. The smell of earth rushed him so hard it made his head spin. He had grown up near rivers and fields, but this was different, a raw scent that carried rot and growth in the same breath. Mara followed, her hand brushing his sleeve as she passed. He felt the contact more sharply than he expected, a jolt that had nothing to do with fear. They walked a few paces from the door and turned back together. From the outside, the vault entrance was a round wound in the hillside, smooth metal set against rough stone and moss. It did not glow. It did not hum. It did not look important. "It looks small," Mara said. "That is the trick," Elias said. "As long as it stays dull, it stays lost." A low creak came from the frame as the door began to slide shut behind them. Elias had not given the signal. The system was set to close on its own once the outer sensors lost all trace of power. Mara watched it move with a tight mouth. "It feels wrong to leave it open even for a breath." "We did not leave it open," Elias said. "We left it blind." The door sealed with a final thud that carried more weight than sound. The hillside returned to a shape that could pass for natural. The vault was gone, not hidden by magic, but by the simple act of being quiet. For a moment they stood in the clearing with no roof and no wall, both aware that the space behind them was no longer a room, but a promise that could fail. Elias felt the first real pinch of fear then, not the sharp jolt that had followed him all morning, but a deeper sense that the ground under his life had thinned. Mara pulled her coat closer around her body. "How long can it stay like that?" she asked. "As long as nothing inside tries to speak," Elias said. "Air will cool. Water will settle. It will start to look like rock to anything that is not human." "And to anything that is," Mara said. He did not deny it. They started down the narrow track that wound toward the road, both stepping with care, both turning their heads at every new sound. Without the soft cage of the vault, the forest felt loud in a way that made Elias tense. Leaves scraped, branches clicked. Somewhere to the east, a hollow boom rolled through the hills, not close enough to feel, but near enough to register as a change in the air. Mara stopped and touched his arm. "Do you hear that?" "Yes," Elias said. "Is that them?" "I do not know," he said, and hated how small the answer felt. They walked on. The path ended at a strip of broken pavement where a sign lay on its side, half buried in ivy. The road beyond curved toward the city, its lines faded, its surface pocked by roots that had begun to claim it. No cars passed. No wind stirred the dust. Mara looked back once more toward the trees. "It feels like we just cut our tie to a clock," she said, "like the days are about to stop lining up." Elias glanced at his wrist, then let his arm fall. "We will make our own marks," he said, "steps, meals, the way the light changes." She gave a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "I hope that is enough." He did not answer. They walked toward the city with the sense of a door closing behind their backs, not in the forest, but in the way the world had always told them when to wake and when to rest. Chapter 5. the suburbs without people. The road into Issaquah bent through rows of houses that looked like they had been set out for a show that never opened. Driveways held cars with doors left wide, one still running with its lights stuck on high beam. A grocery bag lay torn near a mailbox, apples rolling in the dust where no one had bent to pick them up. The town had not broken. It had simply paused. Elias walked a few steps ahead, a stub of white chalk in his hand. Every time they passed a corner or a fork, he knelt and drew a small mark on the curb, a slanted line that pointed back the way they had come. It was not for someone else to find. It was for himself, a way to make the ground remember him. Mara drifted from yard to yard, her eyes fixed not on the houses but on the strips of grass that framed them. The lawns had already lost their shine. Without steady water, they were turning the dull shade that came before brown. She knelt beside a small maple planted too close to a fence and pressed her fingers into the soil. It came away dry, crumbling into pale dust. "They will not last," she said. Elias paused and looked back. "People," he said, thinking she meant the houses. "No," Mara said. "The green. It is the first to go when care ends." He joined her by the fence. The maple's leaves curled at the edges, their veins faint and tired. "I never thought about grass as a choice," he said. "It is," Mara said. "It only lives where people decide it should." They moved on through streets that had lost their reason to be streets. Mail sat in open boxes. A dog bowl lay full on a porch, the water inside filmed with dust. Somewhere inside a house, a clock ticked, loud in the still air, counting toward a time that no longer had a use. At the edge of town, the land dipped toward a low shopping strip. Elias climbed onto the curb and scanned the skyline. Bellevue rose beyond the trees in a line of glass and steel that still caught the sun. Above it, dark frames arched between rooftops, thicker now, more sure of their place. The shapes did not flash or pulse. They simply stood, like bones grown in the wrong place. Mara followed his gaze. "They are not tearing anything down," she said. "No," Elias said. "They are emptying it." They crossed into Bellevue by way of a side road where office parks stood in neat rows. Inside the first tall building they passed, desks lined the windows like a waiting room. Screens were dark, chairs tucked in, jackets slung over the backs as if their owners had stepped out for lunch. High above, a lattice of dark rails pressed against the glass from the outside, hugging the structure with patient care. Mara walked closer to the wall and peered in. "This place still smells of soap," she said. "It should not feel fresh." A soft crackle sounded from the far end of the block. Elias lifted his hand, palm out. They froze. The sound came again, not loud, more like the snap of dry twigs, but it came from the side of a tower where a wide bundle of cables once fed power into the building. The cables had been peeled away, their ends drawn into a thick rib that fed into the arch above. The building itself stood whole, but hollow, like a shell after a tide. "They take the parts that speak," Elias said. "They do not care for walls." Mara wrapped her arms around herself. "It is like watching a city lose its voice." They walked on in silence, moving through blocks that once had signs and sound and now had only the weight of absence. Elias marked each turn with chalk, not trusting his sense of direction in a place that no longer matched any map he had known. He marked a cross at the base of a stop sign, a dot on the back of a bus shelter, a short line on the stone step of a closed cafe. Mara stopped at a schoolyard where swings hung still, their chains rusted at the joints. The grass beneath them had worn bare into hard patches of dirt, where feet had scuffed day after day. She knelt and brushed the surface with her palm. "This will go first," she said. "Then the shallow trees. Then the shrubs that need trim to live. After that, the roots will push through sidewalks, and no one will curse them for it." Elias watched her from a few steps away, feeling the ache in his legs without caring. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The work." "I miss the patience," Mara said. "You cannot rush a culture to learn how to live without light. You wait. You watch. You do not force." He nodded once, though he did not fully know what she meant. They crossed a bridge over a narrow creek that ran thin and brown through a bed of stones. On the far side, a tall tower had been stripped almost bare, its metal skin smoothed into ribs that curved inward. The top floors of the building behind it were dark, their windows blank. The frame overhead pressed down like a crown, not heavy but final. Mara touched Elias's sleeve. "Look!" On the far wall of the tower, a faint glow ran along a seam, not bright, more like the shine of a wet leaf. As they watched, the glow faded, leaving the surface dull and flat. "It is done with that one," Elias said. "Done," Mara repeated, as if testing the word. They found water in a public fountain that still held a trickle, drawn by gravity from a tank on the hill above. They took turns cupping their hands and drinking, the water tasting faintly of stone. Elias filled their bottles while Mara stood guard, eyes always on the sky. When they moved on, the road narrowed and the trees closed in again, marking the shift from town to campus. The towers were closer now, their dark arcs more complex, their lines weaving between structures that had once been proud of their clean edges. Elias drew a final chalk mark at the corner, where the street bent toward the north wing. He did not know if it would last an hour in the damp air, but he drew it anyway, the act itself more important than its life. Mara paused beside him. "If this works," she said, "and we go back to that hole in the ground with the thing we came for, will the green stay?" Elias met her gaze. "It will have a chance." She nodded and took a breath that sounded like a promise she did not say aloud. They stepped toward the shadow of the university together, leaving behind the suburbs that had lost their people without ever being touched. Chapter 6. The Ferry Terminal. The ferry terminal sat low at the edge of the Sound. Its wide roof stretched out over empty lanes where buses once lined up in neat rows. The glass walls were still whole, but the doors stood open as if the building had tried to welcome people who never came. The water beyond lay flat and gray, reflecting a sky that no longer seemed to belong to any hour. Elias led them inside and eased the door shut behind them, not to lock it, but to cut the wind. The inside held the stale scent of salt and old fuel. Rows of plastic seats faced the empty docks, their metal frames cold to the touch. A clock hung above the ticket booth, its hands frozen at a time that might have been lunch, or morning, or none of the above. They chose a corner near a wall of dark windows where they could watch the skyline across the water. The towers on the far shore had changed shape since afternoon. Dark arches now leaned between buildings like ribs, and long rails stretched over blocks that once shone with screens and signs. The work happened without flash or roar. Pieces slid into place as if the air itself had learned a new habit. Mara sat with her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around them. Elias leaned against the wall, the cold of the concrete pressing through his coat. For a long stretch they said nothing, both caught in the same loop of watch and wait that had ruled their day. At last Mara spoke, not loud but clear in the hollow space. "I do not know what hour it is." Elias glanced at the frozen clock and gave a short, tired breath. "Neither do I." She looked back at the water. "I used to mark my days by feeds. Every 4 hours, then 6, then 12 when the cultures grew strong enough. Now there is no mark. Just this." He nodded. "At the hub I knew the day by pressure, by how hard the pumps worked to keep up. When the sun rose, the load changed. When people woke, the pipes told the tale. It feels like we cut a line I did not know I was holding." Mara tilted her head, studying him in a way that was not about plans or steps. "What were you going to do tomorrow?" she asked. The question landed heavier than any noise they had heard all day. Elias closed his eyes and saw the small kitchen he had left behind. The coffee cup he had not washed. The note on his table that held a grocery list, half crossed out. "I was going to fix a leak in my sink," he said at last. "It had been dripping for weeks. I kept telling myself it could wait." Mara smiled, a thin curve that carried more ache than joy. "I was going to teach a first year how to spot a bad culture before it poisoned the rest." She was scared of touching the trays. "I was going to tell her that most work is just being gentle at the right time." They fell quiet again, but the silence had shifted. It was no longer only the absence of sound. It held their words like a place that could be filled. Across the water, a new rail slid into place between two high towers, its surface dull and dark. When it locked in, the windows along the lower floors of one building went blank in a single sweep, like breath drawn from a body. "My father worked in one of those," Elias said without looking away. "Not that one. Another glass block like it. He took the bus in every day, rain or shine. Said he liked to watch the sound wake up." Mara followed his gaze. "Did you call him?" Elias shook his head. "The phones were gone before I thought to try." She drew in a breath and let it out slow. "My sister has 2 boys," she said. "I was meant to visit this week. I kept putting it off because the grant work was heavy. I told myself I would go next month when things were calm." Her voice caught on the last word. Calm had been a thing people planned for. Now it felt like a rumor from another age. Elias shifted closer, not touching, but near enough that he felt the heat from her coat. "I am sorry," he said. "So am I," Mara said. She did not wipe the wet shine from her eyes. She let it be part of the night. They watched the skyline until their eyes ached. The dark arches multiplied, tracing paths between buildings that had once held pride in their height and shine. The city was not burning. It was being edited. At some point, the chill of the terminal crept through Elias's bones. He flexed his fingers and thought of the vault behind them, blind and quiet under its blanket of soil. He tried to imagine it waiting for them like a closed fist. Mara shifted her weight and leaned back against the wall. "We should rest," she said, though her tone held no order in it. He nodded and slid down until he sat beside her. The floor was cold, but his legs were too tired to care. They sat with their shoulders nearly touching, both staring at the same patch of dark water where the ferries used to cut white scars through the sound. Minutes passed, or perhaps more. Without time to frame them, they drifted into a softer state of watch that did not need words. Mara's head tipped to one side, then stilled against his shoulder. Elias felt the weight and went rigid, afraid to disturb her. Her breath slowed, settling into a pattern that matched the quiet lap of water against the dock far below. He did not move. He studied the reflection of the towers in the glass across from them, warped by dust and the faint glow from the city. He thought of his mother's kitchen, of the way she always left the light over the sink on at night so no one would trip on the way to water. He thought of his brother's laugh, loud and careless, the kind of sound that made rooms feel full. Mara shifted in her sleep, a small sound escaping her lips and pressed closer without knowing it. Elias let his shoulder relax just enough to meet her weight. He did not put his arm around her. He did not speak. He only stayed. Across the sound, another rail locked into place. More windows went blank. The city grew quiet in a new way, not by force, but by design. Elias watched until his eyes burned and the shapes blurred into a single dark mass. He wondered how many people were still sitting in places like this, holding on to each other without knowing why, waiting for a sound that would not come. Chapter 7. University of Washington. The first buildings of the campus rose out of the tree line like familiar faces that had forgotten their names. Brick halls leaned under frames of dark metal that had not been there before. Antennas that once stood straight now curved inward, their tops melted into wide ribs that pressed against the roofs of lecture rooms. The work was clean, almost gentle, as if the place had been planned for this shape long before anyone built classrooms. Elias stopped at the edge of the main walk and drew a short chalk mark on a stone post, then another on the low wall across from it. The marks were plain lines, nothing that would catch the eye unless you were looking for them. He wiped the dust on his pants and nodded for Mara to move. They passed a dorm with its doors propped open by chairs that had been dragged into the hall. Inside, beds lay neat, blankets still folded at the foot like the people who slept there had stood up in a rush and meant to return. The lights were gone, but wide panels of glass let in enough gray shine from the sky to show the empty shape of the place. Mara slowed near a stairwell where a bundle of thick cables once fed power into the building. The floor around it was bare, scraped smooth in a circle as if a great hand had brushed away years of dust. The cables themselves were no longer cables. They had been drawn into a single rib that ran up the wall and vanished into the dark frame above. "They did not cut it," she said. "They changed it." Elias crouched and touched the smooth scar on the floor. The surface was warm. "The flow is gone," he said. "No heat, no buzz, just form." They moved on through a quad where benches sat under trees that had begun to drop leaves out of season. The air carried the faint scent of ozone, not strong, but steady, like the memory of a storm that never came. Overhead, the arches stitched one hall to the next, crossing paths that students had once filled with noise. Mara paused near a wide lecture building where the front doors hung open. Inside, rows of seats faced a dark board. Above the board, a long rail pressed through the wall from the outside, its end smoothed into a shape that felt less like a break and more like a join. "It is all being taken apart and put back together," she said. "Not for us." Elias marked another turn with chalk and led them down a side path that curved behind the science wing. The ground here sloped into a shallow dip where a service trench ran under a metal grate. The grate had been peeled away and leaned against a tree. Beneath it, a bundle of buried lines had been pulled from the soil like roots exposed after a flood. They did not spark or hiss. They lay dull and dry, each strand fused into a thicker band that fed into the dark lattice above. Mara knelt at the edge of the trench and pressed her palm to the dirt. "This soil was warm this morning," she said. "It held the trace of people moving over it. Now it is cold." Elias scanned the sky, uneasy without knowing why. "We should not stay here," he said. They had gone no more than 10 steps when a thin tone cut through the quiet. It was not loud. It was not even steady. It was the start of a fire alarm that had lost the strength to finish its own call. Mara gasped and grabbed Elias's arm. He felt her nails bite through his sleeve. The sound held for half a breath, then died, leaving the air thicker than before. They stood frozen, both aware of how large they felt in a place that had learned how to listen for shape instead of noise. "Do not move," Elias said, his mouth close to her ear. He did not know if words carried any risk now, but his voice came out as a hush all the same. They waited. Elias counted his pulse by feel in his neck, not trusting any habit that depended on tools. One beat, then another, then the space between where a sound might have been. Nothing happened. Mara eased her grip but did not let go. Her breath came fast, then slowed. "It is like the place tried to scream," she said. "And forgot how," Elias said. They did not linger. They crossed the quad at a low run, keeping close to the walls where the arches cast deep shade. The biophysics wing rose ahead, its lower level cut into the hill like a buried thought. Above it, the dark rails curved inward, pressing closer to the stone than anywhere else they had seen. Elias drew one last chalk mark at the edge of the entry stair and followed Mara down into the shadow, both of them keenly aware that the campus was no longer a place meant for people, but a shape being worn by something that had never known the sound of a crowd. Chapter 8. In the dark with living things. The chamber doors sealed behind them with a low thud that felt heavier than it sounded. The last strip of hall light slid away, and then there was nothing at all, not dim, not shade, the kind of dark that made it hard to trust the space between one breath and the next. Elias stood still and waited for his eyes to do what they always tried to do. They did not. He could not see his own hands when he lifted them in front of his face. The air felt cool and close, like the inside of a root cellar. "Do not move yet," Mara said somewhere to his left. Her voice was calm, but he heard the care she put into each word. "Let your ears settle." He did as told and let the quiet press in. At first he heard only his breath, then the faint drip of water far away, then a low, wide hush that was not a sound so much as the memory of one. The room was not empty. It was full of things that did not speak. "Tell me what you feel," Mara said. He slid one foot forward and brushed the floor with the sole of his boot. Smooth concrete. Then his hand found a metal post that was cool and narrow, part of a frame meant to hold something taller than either of them. "I am at the outer rack," he said. "Good," Mara said. "The living stack is built in layers." "I need to know which side you are on." He followed the post upward until it curved and ended in a soft, uneven mass that did not feel like steel at all. It gave slightly under his touch, like firm soil packed into a skin. "I think I have found a living layer," he said. "That is the mycelial shell," Mara said. "Do not pull yet. Let me reach you." Her steps were careful, a slow brush of cloth and boot that told him she was mapping the room with her body the way she had always mapped growth beds and root trays. A moment later her hand found his wrist. Her fingers were warm. "Stay," she said. "I will trace from here." She slid her hand from his wrist to the living mass and paused, pressing her palm flat against it. Elias felt a faint give under both their hands, a softness that seemed to shift when touched, not away but around. "It is awake," Mara said. "It does not need light. It needs pattern. I have to teach it the shape of where it will live next." "How?" Elias asked. She did not answer in words. Instead, she began to move her hand in small, slow arcs, pressing and lifting in a rhythm that was almost a breath. Elias felt the surface change under her touch, tiny threads tightening, a subtle rise in warmth that came and went like a thought trying to hold. "It listens through contact," Mara said at last. "It feels pressure the way we feel air." Elias nodded, though she could not see him. "Then I will stay quiet." He slid his free hand along the rack until he found a round housing set into the frame. The metal was smooth and held the faint chill of something that had not moved in a long while. He traced its edge and found a small ridge that matched the shape of a locking ring he had seen in manuals years ago. "I am at a core," he said. "It is not active. The mount is still set for test. You need to free it," Mara said. "Slow." He took out the small wrench from his pack, working by feel alone, and fitted it over the ridge. He turned in a careful arc, counting the movement in his head. The ring shifted with a soft scrape, then loosened. He eased it back, mindful of how sound might carry in a room that was built to hold life in silence. The living layer under Mara's hand gave a tiny pulse that Elias felt through the frame. He froze. "It is fine," Mara said. "It is learning." They worked in this way, neither able to see, both guided by touch and trust. Mara moved along the living shell, tuning it with presses and pauses, mapping its hidden paths the way a person might trace veins on the back of a hand. Elias followed behind her, opening cores and easing them free from their cradles, careful to keep each piece aligned with the next so the system would not forget its shape. At one point his hand slipped, and his fingers brushed skin instead of metal. He flinched, but Mara did not pull away. Her hand stayed over his, their palms aligned on the soft surface of the stack. For a moment neither of them spoke. The room felt smaller then, not in space, but in meaning. Elias became aware of how close she was, of the steady warmth that traveled from her through the living layer and into his own skin. He did not move until she did. "Do not be afraid of it," Mara said softly. "It is meant to be held." He nodded again, though he knew she could not see. "I was not afraid of it," he said. He did not add of what he had been afraid. They continued, hands crossing now without apology, learning the shape of each other in the same way they learned the shape of the stack. At times Mara guided his fingers to a thread that needed care. At times he drew her hand toward a core that had to be eased free in one piece. When the last layer came loose, the room seemed to relax. The faint hush that had filled the dark shifted, not gone, but changed, like a held breath finally let out. "It is ready," Mara said. Elias wrapped both arms around the central column and felt its weight settle into him. It was not heavy in the way metal was heavy. It carried a living drag, a resistance that came from being used to a place it did not want to leave. "We will carry it together," he said. They lifted as one. The stack came free with a soft sound that was not quite a noise, more like a change in the air. Elias felt Mara's shoulder brush his arm as they turned, guiding the living thing toward the door they could not see, but now knew by heart. Chapter 9. Ivy and Silence. They had barely cleared the doors of the biophysics wing when the ground gave a dry snap that echoed off the stone like a bone breaking. Elias froze, the living stack heavy in his arms, its soft skin warm against his coat. The sound came again, sharper this time, followed by a faint hiss, that rose from somewhere beneath the path. Mara's eyes went wide. "That was not us," she said. A pulse ran through the air, not loud, but strong enough to make Elias's teeth buzz. Somewhere under the campus, a dormant transformer had shed its last stored charge, sending a thin wave through cables that no longer had any use. It was not much. It was enough. Above them, the lattice shifted. A dark form detached from one of the arches and drifted down through the gray light. It had no wings, no shape that fit a word. It moved with the care of something that did not need to hurry. "Down," Elias said, not trusting his voice to carry. They turned as one and stumbled into the shadow of a low wall where ivy spilled over the edge in thick green sheets. Elias eased the living stack to the ground and slid under the leaves, pulling Mara with him. The ivy closed around them like water, cool and wet against his neck. They lay on their sides, pressed close, the stack tucked between them like a third heart. Elias could feel Mara's breath on his cheek, quick and shallow. He wanted to tell her to slow it, to make himself useful with words, but he knew better. The ivy was thin. Any sound was too much. The probe passed overhead with a soft drag in the air, like a finger drawn across glass. Elias did not dare look up. He fixed his eyes on a patch of dark soil inches from his face, where pale roots twisted through dirt that had once held grass. The smell of crushed leaves filled his nose. Mara's hand found his wrist. She did not squeeze. She only rested her fingers there, light as if she was afraid even touch might be heard. The hush above them thickened. The air seemed to lean inward, as if the space itself had decided to listen. Elias counted his pulse in his throat, each beat a shout he could not quiet. He tried to think of nothing at all, to empty himself the way the buildings had been emptied. The living stack shifted once between them, a small, wet sound that might have been nothing at all. Mara's breath stopped for half a second, then found its way back in through her nose, slow and careful. The probe drifted lower. Elias felt a faint change in pressure, like the moment before rain, and knew without seeing that it had come close enough to steady the ground. The ivy trembled as a current passed through it, not wind, but attention. Time lost its edges. There was no before or after, only the space under the leaves where his shoulder pressed against Mara's and her breath brushed his skin. He matched his own breath to hers without thinking, letting the shared rhythm take the place of fear. The hush above them deepened, then eased. The pressure lifted, slow as it had come. The ivy settled back into its own weight. They did not move. Elias waited until his muscles began to ache from the strain of stillness. He waited until the part of his mind that begged him to run had tired of begging. Only then did he turn his head the smallest amount and meet Mara's gaze through a gap in the leaves. Her eyes were wide and wet, but steady. She did not smile. She did not speak. She only held his look as if it was something solid in a world that had lost its shapes. He realized then that he did not need to ask if she was all right. The question was too small for what had just passed over them. The answer lived in the way her fingers had found his pulse without being told, in the way their breaths had fallen into the same pattern without command. The probe drifted away with no sound that marked its leaving. Above the ivy, the gray light of the sky slid back into place, dull and harmless, as if nothing had changed. They stayed hidden long after the danger had gone, both aware that moving too soon was its own kind of mistake. When at last Elias lifted his head enough to peer through the leaves, the arches overhead were still, their dark lines woven into the skyline like scars that had already begun to heal. He drew back under the ivy and closed his eyes. His chest felt too full, not with fear now, but with the strange calm that came after it, when the body forgot how to shake. Mara shifted closer, not by choice, but by gravity, the way things did when the ground itself had been spared. Her forehead brushed his cheek. He felt her breath warm against his skin and did not pull away. They lay there in the dark, with a living forest between them, and the open sky above, bound by a silence that had carried them through what words never could. Chapter 10. Carrying a Forest. They waited until the light shifted enough to tell them the air was calm again, then eased out from under the ivy one slow inch at a time. Elias lifted the living stack back into his arms and felt its soft weight pull against him. Not heavy, but stubborn, like soil that refused to leave its place. The ivy tore free in quiet strands and clung to the stack as if it wanted to go along. "We cannot carry it like this," Mara said. "It will fight us every step." Elias nodded, already feeling the strain in his shoulders. "We build a sling." No sound, no metal scrape. They moved to a fallen bench near the edge of the quad, where a few boards still lay whole. Elias slid the bench apart by hand, easing each piece loose instead of snapping it. Mara stripped vines from the wall and twisted them into long cords, her fingers working fast and sure in a way that came from years of tying plants to frames. The stack lay on the ground between them, its surface damp and warm. Elias had the odd sense that it was listening, though he knew that was not the right word. When he tried to shift it onto one of the boards, it dragged back with a slow pull that had no strength in it, only a steady will. "It does not want to go," Mara said. "Nothing does," Elias said, though his voice was not meant to be kind. They set the boards on either side of the stack and looped the vine cords beneath it, working in pairs so no single strand would bear too much weight. Elias kept his hands flat, spreading pressure the way he would with a fragile pipe that could not crack. When they tried to lift, the cords bit into the soft skin of the stack, and it sagged between them like a net full of wet leaves. Elias grunted and felt a sharp slip in his grip. The board edge caught the side of his hand and tore skin with a sound too close to a rip. He hissed and pulled back before he could stop himself. Warmth spread across his palm, slick and quick. Mara was at his side in an instant. She took his wrist and turned his hand to the light that filtered down between the arches. "You cannot bleed on it," she said. "Not as a rule, but as a plea." He looked at the cut, a long split across the pad below his thumb where the board had kissed him hard. It stung more than he expected. "I am fine," he said. She shook her head and reached into her coat. She did not look for a kit. She tore a strip from the lining with her teeth, the sound sharp in the quiet, and pressed the cloth to his skin with firm care. "Hold still," she said. He did. She wrapped the strip around his palm in tight loops, tying it off with a knot that held fast. Her hands did not shake. Her face was set in the same focus he had seen when she tuned the living layers in the dark. The stack shifted beside them, a faint tremor passing through its surface like the brush of breath. "It feels it," Elias said. Mara glanced at the living mass and nodded. "It does. It does not know what blood is, but it knows change." They went back to the rig with more care, adjusting the cords so the pressure spread wider. Elias used his good hand to guide the boards, while Mara took the lead on lifting, her back straight, her knees bent in a way that showed she had carried more than books in her life. This time the stack came free with less protest, rising from the ground in a slow, reluctant arc. It sagged between the boards, heavy now in a way that spoke of water and root and unseen depth. They moved in short steps, not trusting the path ahead to stay quiet if they rushed. Each time the stack dipped, Elias felt a tug through the cords as if something inside was trying to settle back into the earth. "It is like moving a tree that does not have a trunk," he said through his teeth. Mara gave a thin smile. "That is because it is a forest that learned how to live in pieces." They reached the edge of the quad where the ground sloped down toward a side street. Elias drew a quick chalk mark on the curb with his good hand, then tucked the chalk away. His injured palm throbbed with each beat of his heart, the pain sharp enough to keep him awake. Halfway down the slope the cords slipped. The stack slid a few inches, and Elias reacted without thinking, shoving his hurt hand under the sagging mass to catch it. Fire tore up his arm, and he bit down on a cry, tasting salt and iron. Mara swore under her breath and let the boards fall, dropping to her knees beside him. She pulled his hand free and cradled it between both of hers, pressing the cloth tighter. "You cannot do that again," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I did not plan to," he said, though his eyes had gone bright with the pain. She leaned close, her forehead nearly touching his. "You have to let it fall if it slips," she said. "We can fix the rig. We cannot fix you." He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. They rebuilt the sling where they knelt, adding more vines, more wrap, more give. The stack seemed to settle into the new cradle, its surface smoothing under their hands like soil after rain. When they lifted again, it held. They walked on with their forest between them, Elias guiding with his good hand, Mara bearing the weight with a quiet strength that did not need words. Behind them the campus stood hollow and altered, but for the moment they were only two people carrying something that refused to be left behind. Chapter 11. The Longest Walk. They left the campus by a narrow service road that cut behind old labs and storage sheds, a place that had never been meant for crowds. The living stack swayed between them in its sling, a slow pull that set the pace of their steps. The streets beyond were quieter than the suburbs had been, not paused, but worn, as if the day had already passed over them once and moved on. Elias drew chalk marks at each turn, small slants on curbs and walls that would mean nothing to anyone else. His wrapped hand throbbed with a dull heat that came and went in waves, but he kept his grip light, letting the rig take the load. The stack seemed calmer now, its weight settling into the cords like it had agreed, for the moment, to be carried. Mara walked a half step behind him, watching the windows and doorways as if they might speak. When they passed a playground, she slowed, eyes fixed on a set of bright plastic slides that still shone in the shade of a maple tree. "I grew up 2 streets from a place like that," she said. "It was the only park in our area. The swings were bent and the sand always held glass, but it was ours." Elias glanced back at her. "I did not have one of those. My block was all shops. When I was small, I would sit in the back room of my mother's store and draw on the order sheets. She let me keep the ones that were wrong." Mara smiled at the thought. "What did you draw?" "Pipes," he said, "even then. I liked how lines met without asking." They walked on past rows of houses that leaned into each other like tired friends. Lawns had begun to lose their edge. Without care, they were giving way to weeds that pushed through cracks in the pavement, green where grass had gone thin. Mara knelt beside a curb where a cluster of small purple flowers had forced their way through the seam between stone and road. She brushed them with her fingers. "These will last," she said. "They do not need much. They wait." Elias watched her from a few steps away, the chalk stub heavy in his pocket. "You talk about plants like they choose." "They do," Mara said. "Not in words, in shape." They lifted the stack again and turned down a street where tall hedges blocked the view of the main road. The air here felt softer, shielded from whatever work went on above the skyline. Elias let his steps slow, not because he was tired, but because he did not want the walk to end. After a while he spoke without looking at her. "When the hub shut down, I kept thinking that someone would come back for me. A call, a signal. Even after the printer gave me that slip of paper, I still thought it was part of a plan that would wrap around me." Mara said nothing, letting the silence hold his words. "I do not like the idea of going out like this," he went on. "Not loud, not seen, just gone. Like a gauge that stops moving, and no one notices because the board is dark." She slowed until the rig drew them close, the space between their shoulders shrinking. "I notice you," she said. He swallowed and nodded, though he could not trust his voice. They crossed a small bridge over a drainage canal, where trash had collected into a low dam. Water slid under it with a soft hiss, the only steady sound they had heard in hours. On the far side, Mara paused and leaned the rig against a fence so the stack could rest. "If this works," she said, "I want to grow things that do not belong underground. Not because they need it, but because we do." Elias leaned on the fence beside her. "Like what?" "Like sunflowers," Mara said. "They will never see the sky again, but they will still turn their heads toward any hint of light. And strawberries. And mint. Because the smell alone can make a place feel alive." He smiled despite himself. "That does not sound like a lab." "It is not," she said. "It is a home." They stood there longer than they should have, each holding the image she had made, a quiet room under the earth filled with green that did not know what hour it was. When they set out again, their hands brushed on the sling bar. Elias felt the contact like a small spark through his bandage. He did not pull away. Neither did she. For a breath, they walked with their fingers less than a hair apart, the space between them thinner than it had been all day. Then a sound echoed down the street, not loud, but sharp enough to break the moment, and they both drew back, the near touch left hanging in the air behind them. They did not speak of it. They lifted the stack and kept going, carrying their forest through back streets that had lost their names, each step a small claim against a world that no longer cared to see them. Chapter 12. The Blind Sequence. The ridge rose out of the forest like a broken tooth, bare stone thrust up through trees that had learned to bend around it. At the top sat a narrow shed with no marks and no shine, its door no more than a slab of dull metal set into rock. This was the control node, the place that told the vault when it was allowed to breathe. They set the living stack down at the base of the shed and stood for a moment with their hands on their knees, both breathing hard. Elias's wrapped palm had gone numb, the skin around the cloth pale and tight. "The field is thick here," Mara said. She did not need to explain. The air carried a pressure that made the ears want to close, not a sound, but the sense of something sweeping past just out of reach. Elias tried to answer, and found that the words would not line up. He straightened too fast, and the world tipped, the trees bending into dark lines that cut across his sight. Mara caught his arm. "Sit," she said. He shook his head. "No time." But there was no arguing with a body that had already decided. His legs folded, and he dropped to the stone with a dull knock that he did not feel until later. Mara knelt beside him, her hands on his face, turning it so he could look at her. "Stay with me," she said. He tried to smile and could not find the muscle. The sound in the air grew heavier, the same hush they had known under the ivy, but wider now, as if the sky itself had leaned in. "You know the steps," he said, forcing the words out one by one. No power, no sound. The wheel in the dark. Her jaw tightened. "I need your hand. You have it," he said. "In your head." The shed door stood open, black inside like a throat. The chalk marks he had left on the path glowed faint in the thin light, pointing back the way they had come, a line of small claims against the dark. Mara pressed her forehead to his for a breath, then rose and moved into the shed. The inside held no lamp. Only the shape of the wheel cut the dark where it had been worn by hands that trusted memory more than sight. She closed her eyes, not because she could see, but because it felt right to let the world drop away. Her fingers found the first notch on the wheel, the shallow dip that marked the start of the blind turn. She drew a slow breath and began. Outside, Elias lay on the stone and counted nothing at all. The hush thickened, a pressure that made the skin on his arms prickle. He imagined the dark frames over the city leaning inward, their lines bending toward this one small point on a ridge that refused to speak. Mara turned the wheel one notch, then another, her hands sure in a way she had not known they could be. She moved through the steps Elias had spoken so many times they had become a map in her mind. Half turn, pause, quarterback, long pull. Each motion felt like a thread being tied in the dark. The air shifted. Elias felt it first, a cold wash across his face that did not belong to the forest. His chest tightened and he fought the urge to cough, knowing any sound was a mistake. Inside the shed, Mara reached the final mark. The wheel caught and held, a heavy stop that meant the vault had been told it was safe to open, if safety still had a shape. She did not wait. She stumbled back into the light and ran to Elias, hauling him up under his arms with a strength she did not know she had. His head lolled against her shoulder, his breath shallow and uneven. "The door," he whispered, and then nothing more. She dragged him down the ridge path, half carrying, half pulling, the living stack bumping along behind them in its sling. The hush pressed closer, thick enough now that the leaves on the trees lay flat, as if under unseen rain. At the vault wall, the round slab had already begun to turn. The stone around it trembled, a deep motion that felt like a held breath finally being let go. Mara pulled Elias the last few steps, his boots scraping on gravel, her own lungs burning. The door slid back with a harsh cry that tore at the air, and she shoved him through the opening with no care for grace. She fell after him, dragging the stack across the threshold as the light from the forest cut off behind her. The door slammed shut with a weight that settled into her bones. Darkness rushed in, thick and complete. For a moment there was only her breath and the sound of Elias trying to find his. Then, slowly, the low floor strips came back to life, painting the stone with a thin line of calm. Mara slid down beside him and held his face in both hands, the world outside gone again, the vault blind and quiet as it had been made to be. Chapter 13. Rebuilding the Heart. Mara worked without waiting for light to feel right. The floor strips gave off a low band of shine that traced the walls and little else, but her hands did not need more. She guided the living stack into the wide port at the back of the chamber, easing its soft sides against stone that had never meant to touch anything alive. Elias lay on a mat near the wall, his chest rising in short pulls, the color slow to return to his face. The stack did not slide in like a part meant to fit. It met the frame with a gentle pushback, a quiet refusal that made Mara pause. She placed both palms flat on its surface and leaned close, her ear almost brushing the damp skin. "You are home," she said, not as an order, but as a fact she needed to be true. She shifted her pressure in small arcs, tuning the living layers the way she had in the dark chamber under the campus. The resistance eased. The stack flowed forward a fraction at a time, finding the shape it had been denied. Elias stirred behind her. "Is it in?" he asked. "Almost," she said. She slid the final band into place and felt a change in the air that had nothing to do with heat or wind. It was as if the room had learned how to draw breath. The pipes overhead did not hum. The vents did not stir. Yet the vault felt less like a box and more like a hollow under a tree. Mara moved to the main board and began the final steps, not with switches but with closures. One by one she turned the mechanical lines away from service, sealing pumps and filters that had never been meant to live without power. She cut the link to the last fan, then pressed the lock plate over it with a firm click. The vault did not protest. Instead, a soft motion traveled through the living stack, a slow shift that carried into the walls and back again, like water moving through roots. The stale edge in the air faded. The damp stone took on the scent of soil. Elias pushed himself upright, his face pale in the low shine. He sat and looked around with eyes that had learned the shape of the room by loss. "It feels different," he said. "It is," Mara said. "It is no longer pretending to be a machine." She brought out the small case she had guarded since the campus, a flat box lined with cloth that held a handful of wrapped packets. She opened it with care and took out the first, a square of thin paper folded over itself. "Strawberries," she said, as if she had to name them to make them real. Elias shifted closer, resting his back against the stone. He watched as she knelt beside the base of the stack where a shallow bed had been set into the floor, meant for nothing more than testing once upon a time. She pressed her fingers into the dark mix of compost and gel that filled it, then slid the seeds free from their wrap and placed them one by one into the waiting soil. "They will not know the sky," he said. "They will know us," Mara said. She covered the seeds and smoothed the surface with her palm, then leaned in and breathed over the spot, not for any reason she could explain, only because it felt right to give the first breath to a place that had learned how to breathe back. Elias felt something break loose in his chest that had been held too tight for too long. He did not make a sound. He only bowed his head and let the tears come where no one could see them in the low shine of the floor light. They ran down his face and darkened the stone between his boots. Mara turned at the soft shift in the air and saw the curve of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands. She did not cross the room. She did not speak. She let him have the quiet he had carried through the day. When he lifted his head again, his eyes were clear in a way they had not been before. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and gave a small nod that did not ask for anything. The vault settled around them. The old gauges stayed still. The pump slept. In their place the living stack moved with a patience that did not count minutes. The room held a steady feel, not warm, not cold, but balanced, like a cellar under a garden that had never been cut. Mara leaned back on her heels and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the faint pulse in the walls tell her that the system had found its shape. When she opened them, she saw Elias watching the seedbed as if it were the only proof left that the day had happened at all. "We will have to learn it again," she said. "How to live without asking a board what to do." He gave a quiet laugh that held no edge. "I think I am ready to stop asking." They sat in the dark with the soundless work of a forest beginning behind the stone, and for the first time since the sky had gone blank, the vault felt less like a refuge and more like a heart. Chapter 14. A Vault That Breathes. The change came without warning or mark. One moment the vault felt like a place held together by habit and stone. The next it felt as if it had always been this way, a hollow shaped for breath instead of work. The air carried no sharp edge, no hint of old filters or cold pipes. It smelled of damp soil and crushed leaf, of something that had never known a switch. Mara walked the length of the chamber with her hand brushing the wall. She did not expect warmth, yet she found it, not heat, but a mild give that came from life working in small ways beyond sight. She stopped beneath one of the empty frames and pressed her palm flat to the stone. "It is alive," she said, her voice low as if the words themselves might startle it. Elias stood near the old console, the board that had once ruled the room. He had turned every lever down and sealed every port, yet the vault had not dimmed. It had changed. He watched the thin line of floorlight pulse in time with nothing he could name. "All the patterns I knew are gone," he said. "There is no loop left to guard." Mara crossed to him. "That is why they will not find us," she said. "There is nothing here that speaks their kind of order." He traced the edge of the dead console with his fingers, feeling the dust gather there, unused. "I spent my life keeping things in line," he said, "making sure water went where it was told, making sure no drift went unseen." She rested her hand over his, gentle. "You are still keeping us alive," she said, "just not in the way you learned." He closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold metal for a moment, then drew back and let his hand fall from the board. The sound of it was small, but it felt final, like a door being closed in a house that no longer needed rooms. They stood there, both aware that the world beyond the stone had not changed, that the dark arches still cut the sky, that the city still lay hollow and patient. Yet inside the vault, the hush they had feared had taken on a new shape, not absence, but presence that did not need to speak. Mara moved to the seedbed and knelt, lifting a corner of soil to feel the damp beneath. "They will sprout in a few days," she said. "Not fast. They will take their time, the way all things do when no one is shouting at them." Elias joined her and rested his good hand on the edge of the bed. The bandage on his palm had darkened, but the pain had dulled to a distant pulse. "I will miss the noise," he said. "Not the alarms, the small things, the drip of a pipe that told me I was needed." Mara looked at him then, really looked, as if she was mapping a place she had just learned existed. She reached out and touched his cheek, her thumb brushing the line his tears had taken the night before. "You are needed," she said. He did not argue. He did not give a speech or look for a reason to hold back. He leaned forward, slow and unsure, and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a moment shaped for memory. Their mouths met in a soft way, tired and plain, as if they had found the last small thing left in a world that had lost its edges and were simply grateful it had not been taken too. They drew apart and rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air that no longer needed tools to move. Later they lay side by side on the mat near the wall, the vault breathing around them in slow, unseen waves. The floor strips dimmed to their lowest shine, and the dark wrapped them in a way that no longer felt like a threat. Somewhere beyond the stone the arches leaned and lines were drawn, but the vault held its own shape, dull and lost to any hunt that needed signal to see. Mara drifted toward sleep with her hand still resting over Elias's heart, and he let the last thread of his old habits slip away, trusting the quiet life growing in the walls to do what no machine ever had. Chapter 15. The day the world ended, I met you. The strawberries grew without ever seeing the sky. They formed in the dark soil at the base of the living stack, pale at first, then slowly deepening into a red that Mara learned to judge by touch alone. She brushed her fingers over each small fruit every morning, feeling for the slight give that told her it was time. Elias sat nearby with a shallow bowl on his knee, the floor strips at their lowest shine tracing the curve of his boots and the edge of the bed. He listened to the faint sound that had become the heart of the vault, a low, steady murmur that was not quite noise, not quite silence. It did not follow a clock. It followed itself. Mara lifted the first ripe berry free and placed it in his hand. The skin was cool, the seeds raised like tiny beads. He turned it once between his fingers, then bit into it with care, juice sliding down his thumb. "It tastes like summer," he said. She smiled in the dark, knowing he could not see it, and went back to the soil. They had learned the vault, the way people once learned fields, by noticing where damp held longest, where roots reached deeper, where the faint warmth that flowed through the walls gathered most. Elias no longer touched the dead console. The board stood in the corner as a relic, its levers down, its face dull. In its place, he kept notes on scraps of paper, sketches of the way the stack shifted when the room was full of breath, the way the air changed after a meal or a long rest. Mara moved through the beds with the sure grace of someone who had finally found a place that matched her hands. She taught the strawberries to live with little water, trimming their leaves so they learned to keep more for the fruit. She coaxed mint from a cutting the size of her thumb and laughed the first time the scent filled the vault, sharp and clean like a memory of open air. At times they spoke of the world beyond the stone, but not with the hunger they once had. It had become a story they shared in low voices, a place they had walked through and left behind, not by choice, but by the slow work of days that had learned a new shape. One morning Elias traced a line on the wall with chalk and stopped. He stared at the mark, then shook his head and wiped it away with the heel of his hand. "No more maps," he said. Mara looked up from her bed of soil. "Why not?" He shrugged. "I do not need to find my way back anymore." They laughed, not loud, but together, and the sounds settled into the vault like another layer of breath. Sometimes the hum of the stack grew stronger, not in volume, but in presence, a deep shift that ran through the stone and into their bones. On those days they lay on the mat and closed their eyes, letting the living system carry them the way a forest carries a bird on its hidden wind. Mara would place her ear to the wall and listen as if to a shell. "It is busy today," she would say. Elias would nod, even when he did not feel the change himself. He trusted her senses the way he had once trusted gauges. They marked months by harvests, by how often the mint had to be cut back, by the way the strawberries came in small waves that taught patience better than any chart. The outside did not press on them anymore. The vault had no need to hide when there was nothing left inside it that spoke in lines or loops. One night they sat with their backs against the stack, sharing the last of a bowl of fruit. The dark wrapped them in a way that no longer asked questions. Elias felt Mara lean into him and rest her head against his shoulder, the same way she had at the ferry terminal when the world still seemed to have a direction. "Do you remember the day it all stopped?" she asked. He thought of the printer at the hub, the thin strip of paper curling in on itself like a leaf. He thought of the quiet roads and the arches over the city. He thought of the way her hand had found his under ivy without being told. "I remember meeting you," he said. She lifted her head and pressed a light kiss to his cheek, not for a moment that would be held up, but for the one they were in, the only one that still made sense. They sat in the dark and listened to the vault breathe, not as a victory over what had been lost, but as a way to stay. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please hit the like and subscribe button, and if you have any suggestions for stories you would like, comment them below. On the right is a video of mine YouTube thinks you'll like. Watch it if you would like more of this content. Have happy dreams.